Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm your host, Samantha Reigle. I've spent more than 20 years as a mediator helping people resolve conflicts. But here on this podcast, I like to look at why conflict even shows up in the first place, and then what is it revealing to us and how we can respond to make our lives a whole lot easier. Okay, so today I want to talk about the war in Iran that we now have found ourselves in. As always, war is about as big of a conflict that there could be, so I would be remiss if I didn't speak up about it. This war with Iran seemed to erupt almost overnight. I mean, we heard rumblings about rising tensions between them and Israel, and the U.S. might get involved. But I think the actual escalation still caught most of the population by surprise. It definitely caught me off guard. And I'm not really interested in getting into a debate about whether the strikes were justified or what the geopolitical strategy is supposed to be. That's really not my lane on this podcast. But I did want to talk about what caught my attention. And that was in the way people are responding to the news of this war. I'm noticing a pretty clear pattern. I mean, collectively, the emotional response or lack thereof is just making me shake my head in shock and amazement. I am not seeing any kind of reaction that would be typical when the U.S. goes to war. Think about it. When you step back and look, the way that we're reacting to this war feels very different from the way the country reacted to past wars. And this observation is actually making me feel a little hopeful. Not hopeful about war. There is really nothing hopeful about another conflict where potentially thousands of people could lose their lives. War is still one of the most horrific expressions of our species, a species that somehow still kills its own. But I'm hopeful in that the response to war might be changing. We are hearing a wave of hysteria forming around the idea that the United States has just entered another 25-year war, but I'm not so sure that's actually how this moment is going to play out and unfold. I know a lot of so-called experts are already drawing comparisons to what happened after 9/11 when the United States invaded Iraq. And on the surface, I understand why people make that comparison, because both situations involved the United States escalating military action in the Middle East. Both involved incredibly complicated regional dynamics, and both raised the fear that the country could be pulled into another long conflict. But the more I sit with it, the more I realize something about this moment feels very different from what we experienced 25 years ago. Emotionally, the atmosphere right now feels completely different. Let me explain. After 9/11, the country was ready for war in a way that is hard to explain unless you live through it. People were very angry. People were grieving. People were scared. And there was a massive emotional surge behind the idea that we needed to strike back. I remember men and women both joining the military in droves because they wanted to be part of the response. They wanted to defend the country. They were leaving their well-paid careers to go fight in the military. They wanted to avenge what had happened on 9/11. The narrative was incredibly clear. There was an enemy, there was a mission, and the public energy behind it was pretty intense. People weren't just accepting the war back then, they were cheering for it. Flags were everywhere, politicians were unified, media messaging was consistent, and the country rallied around the idea that military action was necessary. Now compare that to the reaction that we're seeing now. Nobody seems excited about this war other than the old men that started it. But what's even more striking to me is that people don't even seem particularly angry about it either. I mean, of course, if you go looking for outrage, you can find it. Social media will always give you loud voices. But when you step back and look at the broader emotional tone, outrage doesn't seem to be driving the national conversation. If anything, it almost feels like apathy. In my own social circles, People are barely talking about it. And that's what feels so strange to me, because 25 years ago, after 9/11, it was all anyone could talk about. Every conversation somehow came back to it at work, at family gatherings, everywhere. The war dominated the emotional atmosphere of the country. And now we have this war in Iran, and it barely seems to penetrate everyday conversation. And I have to admit, it feels disorienting to me. And I wondered if you all felt the same. I've personally never lived through a moment where a war involving the United States feels almost like an afterthought in people's daily lives. And it's not that people don't know it's happening. It's more like they're aware of it, but they're emotionally detached from it. And if the topic does come up, the conversations feel very different from what they used to. I mean, when this first happened, even in my own life, my husband said something to me about it. He saw it come across his phone, and I'm like, I don't want to hear it. I don't want to we'll talk about it later. Like, I was putting it off. And I'm seeing the same thing happening, like at a macro level. People are not fired up. They're not mobilized. They're trying to probably piece together what's actually happening, but not really wanting to look at it. And that's another big difference from 25 years ago. Back then, whether people supported the war or opposed it, everyone seemed to understand what was actually happening and what the story was around it. There was a very clear narrative about why the United States was going into Iraq and what the objective was supposed to be, even though now we know it was based on lies. But right now, the tone is much more uncertain. People are asking like the basic questions, like, what are we doing? Where are we? What's happening? What's the plan? Who's paying for this? I mean, Congress hasn't even been fully briefed, and there isn't a clear narrative being presented to the public the way there was 20 years ago. And the thing that really stands out to me isn't just the lack of enthusiasm, it's the lack of energy in general. There isn't a massive pro-war movement like we've seen in the past, but there's also not a massive anti-war movement like we've seen in the past. Like, think about it. Historically, that's very unusual. If you look back at Vietnam, the anti-war movement eventually became enormous. Not only were there massive protests, but the resistance to the war became an entire cultural moment. It was a movement. They had music exploded out of them. I mean, lyrics about not wanting to go to war, and artists and poets and filmmakers, they were all responding to what was happening and creating like this revolution around it. Fashion changed. Ideas about freedom changed. There was a sexual revolution that was accelerated. Experimentation with drugs, the spirituality with the new ways of living and relating to each other. People were questioning authority, questioning institutions, questioning the entire direction of the country. And when you step back and look at that period, what you really see is society recognizing, maybe not consciously, but definitely collectively, that something about the old way of living wasn't working anymore. And the Vietnam War brought that to the surface. So there was this growing sense of misalignment. The structures people had been told to trust, the institutions that were supposed to guide society, the narratives about patriotism and duty didn't feel like they matched anymore what people were experiencing in real life. So when a society senses that kind of misalignment, something interesting is going to happen. People start experimenting. They try on new ways of thinking, new ways of living, new ways of relating to each other, trying to figure out what actually fits the moment they're living in. And that's what we saw in the Vietnam era. It was a cultural revolution. It wasn't just a political moment. It wasn't just a war, right? The conflict and the resistance to it didn't just live in those government buildings or, in the military. It was in the culture. It showed up everywhere. Music, art, the way people thought about freedom and choice. So there was this emotional energy moving through the system. And that energy, whether it showed up as support for the war or resistance to it, it kept the entire national conversation alive. And we saw a version of that again during the Iraq War. Before the invasion even began, millions of people marched around the world protesting it. The party not in power amplified the criticism. Media debates were intense. The country was emotionally engaged. There was energy on both sides. People were either supporting the war and frothing at the mouth for it, or they were fighting against it. But either way, that conflict had momentum. I mean, it's possible that something similar could still happen now. Maybe the public was simply caught off guard by what's happening in Iran, by how quickly it escalated. Maybe resistance will organize in the coming weeks. Maybe protests will grow. That's certainly possible. But right now, a week into this war, that's not what I'm seeing. And yes, some Democratic leaders have come out and said they don't support this escalation, but there isn't a massive resistance movement forming behind these statements. There aren't nationwide protests. There isn't a cultural moment forming around the stopping of the war. It almost feels like everyone's just watching, or maybe even turning their head and not wanting to look at it, like my initial reaction has been. So from a conflict perspective, that's pretty fascinating, because one thing I've learned sitting inside conflict for over 20 years as a mediator is that conflict does run on energy. Your anger and outrage is energy. Righteousness is energy. Resentment is energy. Every conflict needs emotional participation from the people involved. So, in order for it to keep going in the way that it is. And when I'm mediating a conflict, there are times when one of the parties just isn't that engaged. Sometimes they show up to a mediation mostly out of just curiosity, because most people do want peace. So even if they feel justified in their actions, they're still curious about why the other person feels so aggrieved. But this does backfire. And there are times when someone comes to mediation, hears the other person's perspective, and instead of softening, they get even more entrenched in feeling justified. And because mediation is voluntary by nature, they're always free to disengage. They simply choose to leave the mediation. And when that happens, the dynamic of the conflict changes immediately. Sometimes the conflict folds pretty quickly and resolution is had. Other times, the disengaged person leaves the conversation and the other person's left standing there with the decision. Do they escalate it to some larger system, like the courts or some kind of institution, hoping that the system will resolve the conflict for them? Or do they just admit that they're done? There's no one to fight with anymore. The other person doesn't want to fight. Conflict doesn't necessarily disappear when one party is not engaged, but it can't keep operating in the same way it was before. It interrupts the loop. So that energy that used to sustain the back and forth is gone. And it has to find a completely different path to play out. And that's why this response to the war in Iran caught my attention, because when I look at the public reaction right now, it doesn't feel like emotional investment. It feels more like disengagement. For the last 20 years, people have watched the United States move through one war after another in parts of the Middle East. They watched Iraq, they watched Afghanistan, they watched endless military involvement across the region, and people saw that human cost, the economic cost, the instability. So the response now doesn't feel like that emotional surge we saw after 9/11. If anything, it feels more like people looking at the situation and thinking, haven't we seen this already? I know the ending. And that brings me to what I think might actually be happening here. It's possible that the narrative that used to generate public support for war simply isn't working on people anymore. Think about it. For a long time, there was a very reliable script when it came to war. Something would happen internationally. Leaders would frame it as a security threat to get everybody afraid. Then there would be the language of patriotism and protection so that you could activate the population, use their fears against them. And then the country would rally behind the military and military action. And that script has worked over and over and over again. But right now, no one is hearing that script if they're putting it out there. And if they are, it's just not landing in the same way. People aren't rallying. They're not protesting in huge numbers either. They're just not emotionally entering the story. So that when that happens, it tells you something important. It tells you that there may be a growing misalignment between the old response and the moment we're living in now. Societies evolve. The ways we used to respond to conflict don't always fit the realities we eventually grow into. I think we're growing into a more peaceful species, hopefully. Cross my fingers. Either way, I think what we might be feeling collectively right now is the recognition, maybe not fully conscious yet, that the old response to war and violence just isn't producing the safety or stability that it was always promised to be. People have watched decades of conflict unfold. They've seen the destruction. They've seen the human costs. And somewhere along the way, this story that war solves every problem stopped making sense. So if we have leaders reaching for that old script now, we're just not hearing it. And the emotional reaction just isn't there in the same way. And when a response that used to work stops generating energy, that's usually a sign of misalignment. In conflict, misalignment is often the moment right before the shift. It's the moment where the old way can't keep running, but the new way hasn't fully formed yet. And that's why I keep coming back to the idea that we're standing in like a conflict portal right now. The old way of responding to threats through escalation and violence isn't producing the same collective buy-in it once did, but we haven't fully figured out what the new response should be, so we're literally in the doorway. We're at a choice point, not just for the leaders, but for all of us. When society realizes old responses no longer fit, the new question becomes, what will we choose instead? You already know what I'm going to say. Wars almost always end the same way. Anyway, right? Peace talks. That's how every war ends. Eventually the fighting stops, the destruction settles, and people sit down at a table to negotiate the terms of peace. So sometimes I can't help but wonder, if that's where we're always going to end up, why don't we just start there? Why do we insist on walking through the destruction first? And I think a lot of people collectively feel the same way. Maybe the reason this moment feels so different is because more and more are starting to recognize this pattern. We're standing at a collective choice point where the old responses of violence, escalation, war simply don't feel aligned anymore. And if that's true, then the real question isn't just about this conflict. It's about what we choose moving forward as a species. I hope you all enjoyed this perspective on the war in Iran and how it might reflect a larger shift in how we respond to conflict. If you're personally affected by this war, my thoughts are definitely with you, and I'm hoping for a quick resolution. Until next time, don't react, but respond with intention.